Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. So this week, I have the pleasure of welcoming Betsy Winter to the podcast. Betsy and I were connected through Kiley Hanish. So many of you might remember that she was a recent podcast guest in the series Grieving Parents a decade later. So when Kiley introduced us, she mentioned that Betsy and I share not only a passion for supporting those navigating grief and trauma, but also a deep appreciation for somatic approaches to healing. So I'm not sure if Kiley actually said this or if this is what I heard, but it was as if she said, "You two speak the same language." And she couldn't have been more right. Betsy's work dives into the body's innate wisdom and its ability to guide us through some of life's most challenging moments. Our conversation promises to explore themes of resilience, connection, and the transformative power of listening to the body. So if you're curious about how somatic practices can support your healing after loss or trauma, you'll want to lean in for this one. But first, let's hear a little bit more about Betsy. So about this week's guest. Betsy Winter is an experienced mind-body coach and somatic practitioner known for her effective methods in helping individuals transform profound loss and unresolved trauma into deep healing and embodied change. She believes in understanding individuals rather than pathologizing them, viewing each person as the expert of their own experiences. Her client-centered approach is aimed at those seeking self-discovery, deep healing, and sustainable change. Betsy is also a key contributor to the pregnancy and infant loss community, significantly involved in the creation and growth of Return to Zero Hope support groups, retreats, and provider resources. Her work is deeply influenced by the brief life of her daughter Eliza, who was diagnosed with a severe heart defect and trisomy 18 at 31 weeks and stillborn at 41 weeks, and by her own journey of uncovering and healing from layers of unresolved complex trauma from early childhood neglect and abuse. So welcome, Betsy.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
So how are you today?
In this moment, my heart is racing. My fingertips are cold. I'm a little nervous in sharing, being vulnerable. And I'm also honored to be here and eager to talk about my experience with my daughter and what that has opened up in my life. So thank you. And thank you, Kiley, for the opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, we had a little conversation once Kiley introduced us, so I know a little bit about you, but as usual, I want to keep myself fresh as if I was a listener. So why don't you start by sharing a little bit with anyone listening how life has provided you with experiences of loss and trauma?
Okay. My story begins a long time ago, but I didn't really realize how far back my story of loss and trauma went until I went through the devastating loss of my daughter, Eliza, in 2015. So when I was 31 weeks pregnant with my second child, we learned that she had hypoplastic left heart syndrome. And began this odyssey of getting our PhD in pediatric cardiology, trying to understand what our options were And there was no good option with that kind of severe congenital heart defect diagnosis. We had an amniocentesis done at 31 weeks, and 2 weeks later, we had learned at that point that she had trisomy 18 in every cell, and we didn't really know what that meant before going through all of this. But by that point, we knew that there was nothing we could do, nothing Western medicine could do, that she was going to die. And that was our reality. So quickly transitioned out of getting our degree in pediatric cardiology and just kind of entered this very uncharted territory of being pregnant with a baby, knowing that she was going to die. And that really is the beginning of a very significant shift in my life, in who I am, who I know myself to be, and the work that I now do in the world.
Yeah, so when you talked about being pregnant, knowing that your daughter will die, I could relate to the point of, so I had twins, and the younger one, I mean, one doctor said she's going to die and you should terminate one so that the other could grow more. And I was hoping that this wasn't the case, and I was also made to I don't want to say made to believe, because it was a possibility that what they were seeing so far wouldn't be the case. So my gynecologist said, wait until they're born. But I can relate to this moment of shock and still feeling that life within you. So I'm sure that many people listening will have had that experience. So how did you go about your day being pregnant with that knowledge? And so you mentioned that turning point in your life. Maybe share a little bit more. Take us on that journey of how that was for you at that time.
Honestly, it was the only time in my life where I felt the most like myself, was to be pregnant with Eliza and going through this very significant experience. It was like the most sacred thing I had ever been through. And it just opened up the door to me understanding myself in a completely different way. And so I dove headfirst into my process. I don't know. It was like some other force was at play. Everyone would say, you're so strong, you're so brave. I don't know how you're doing this. You're so courageous. And it just felt like I didn't have any other option other than to be so completely present with my daughter in that pregnancy. And we did a lot of things to prepare for her death. And I feel very grateful for that time that I had. I feel very grateful for the people who came forth to support me, continuing to carry a pregnancy with a fatal diagnosis. And yeah, it was like the hardest thing I've ever done. And it was also the most beautiful, sacred thing I have ever done as well.
So you mentioned that people would say, you're so strong, I don't know how you do this. What did they see that made them say that? Yeah. Or what did they not see?
Right. I thought a lot about that after my loss experience, because I had quit my job. We moved across the country. We did all the things you're not supposed to do. And I spent a lot of time in deep, deep introspection. And I was wondering, like, what is it? What is it about me that made this experience the way it was? And I just had profound vulnerability, this ability to be really, my neighbor, this incredible woman, she said you're like a buffalo or a bison of the plains. And that, buffalo, unlike other hooved animals of the plains, when there is a storm on the horizon, the buffalo put their head down and they go like trudging towards the storm. And the storm passes and they move their way through it, where other hooved animals run away from it. So the storm stays with them a lot longer. And so for me, be like a buffalo kind of became my mantra, even though, I wasn't trying to do that. I just did that. And so that is a bit where I think the traumas that were unearthed from this experience really served as like this resource for me and my ability to like go deep into pain and deep into grief and be with my emotions and be vulnerable and speak my truth and put myself out there uninhibited, and that allowed people and the universe to come forward and support me and hold me. And it opened up this portal to such incredible, like divine interventions, divine connections. It was in my ability to be so open and just be in it. I was in the storm, but I wasn't trying to be in the storm in any certain way. I just let the storm move in and all around me. And I was supported. So I was held in the storm by community. And so, I was brave and I was courageous. And that doesn't offend me when people say that about myself. I do think it takes an incredible amount of courage. And I also think it's like the highest honor to be a parent to a child that does not survive. And I don't take that responsibility lightly. I believe I was chosen to be the parent to my daughter and to shepherd her brief life in the way that I did. And I'm very proud of myself and my family for how we did navigate the hardest, one of the most difficult experiences of our life. I've had other difficult experiences, but this one didn't feel like horrific, tragic, dark, scary. It didn't. It felt light and incredibly powerful and it was empowering and sacred and beautiful, which is a very different kind of dark than other darks that I have encountered.
You make a good point there, and you sort of alluded to traumas that were unearthed. But one of the things that I want to bring out here too for people in clarity is that I would say, in other words, pain is not a trauma. So the pain that we feel when we lose a child, it doesn't equate to trauma. So child loss per se doesn't have to be traumatic. It can be traumatic. And that's what you basically said. You said it unearthed other traumas. So we want to go there. But I think it's really important for people to hear this, to make this so clear that grief or a loss doesn't equally immediately mean trauma. Some losses can be traumatic, but don't have to be. So, and I think you gave, me as a trauma specialist as well, I can hear the intrinsic details that didn't make it a trauma. You mentioned support, you mentioned time for preparation. What other things that would you add now, looking back with some perspective, would you say, as, again, a trauma specialist, would you say that helped this to be grief and not also trauma?
Yes. I had space to process anything and everything that was going on inside of my body and my mind amongst a really incredible community of women where I was living at that time. So that some support that I received was so significant. And not only support, we did ritual. Like we held a mother's circle while I was pregnant with my daughter, where the women came together and they, you know, massaged my feet and brushed my hair and sang songs and talked to Eliza while she was in my belly. And they held this incredible space for me. And I, cried and I laughed and I cried and I got angry. And it was all held in this beautiful container with all these women who could be there for me. That didn't make them uncomfortable. They showed up. I also did a lot of kind of holistic movement while I was pregnant. So I actually danced a lot. And so I danced my emotions, I danced my grief, I danced to connect with my daughter. And I danced in community. The women were also there by my side, who provided that little blanket of protection, I guess, that I could be so vulnerable and go through all of this. It was not traumatic. I was able to be in contact with my pure grief. It was unburdened grief, which is kind of interesting to think about because I talk a lot with some of my clients about burden grief and what burdens grief. And usually it is unresolved trauma from your past. And there's other things that tend to burden our grief, kind of block it. And somehow, even though I do have a history of childhood trauma, it didn't burden my grief, which I think is just really interesting. And I don't quite know. Actually, I think it's because I immediately began to connect kind of into the spirit realm with this experience with my daughter, that I do feel like that was a huge resource for me. Like my daughter became my ally. She became my guide. It was a different kind of grief. It was like protected by the power of something that I can't put words to, kind of the existential, like sacred, right? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. So it's interesting, the simplest definition of trauma that I like is too much, too fast for the body to integrate it. So, your story shows you have time, you have co-regulating aspects in terms of community, you have movement. So all these elements that we know.
Ritual, ceremony.
Exactly. That we want to bring out as well for the listeners to see. These are the elements that not contradict trauma, but like the animal that runs into the storm, it actually is a different thing. So for me, if I look at my loss, similar to you, I had a lot of support and the right people, the right situations around me to make this not less hard. So I want to really clarify that. The pain
very
is
painful. Very
painful. That there's no way around it. But the layers afterwards. And so for me, when I look at my experience, there were certain elements that were traumatic, certain small elements. Like, for example, the doctor at 26 weeks, he said, you should think about terminating one baby. And I was like, is there a medical necessity for her twin sister? No. And I said, this was a real, I can remember that time. I could not speak. I could not think. I was traumatized by his word, even especially because we had said to the gynecologist, the woman, we will not consider a termination if not absolutely necessary. I already knew that, and I don't know why. It was just clear to me. So by him saying that, it was a breach of our. It was not her, obviously. He didn't know, but it was a complete no for me. That was a traumatic aspect, but the whole experience in itself was not traumatic. But take us a little bit further, because the interesting part is when you said it unearthed some of those childhood traumas.
Yes, and I want to add one thing to what you just said about your definition of trauma is, Dr. Peter Levine, we want to add like in the absence of a supportive
Yeah.
other. So it's like trauma happens when too much, too little, too fast, too soon. Um, some need isn't being met by a compassionate other,
Yeah.
which I think then points to that helps kind of set us up for my earlier traumas. And this is like fresh for me. This is
Mhm.
more fresh for me. I don't have it all quite packaged up like I do the story of my daughter. I'm 9 years out from that loss. I've been deep and working with people around pregnancy and infant loss. And so for me, as I began to pursue a new career in supporting others experiencing pregnancy and infant loss, which really felt like my calling, as cliche as that sounds, I began to dive deep into training and education in the field of somatics, but not just that, in integrative trauma therapy, attachment therapy, parts work, interrelationship focusing, somatic EMDR. I mean, I have so many trainings under my belt at this point, but each one, as I was going through these programs, I really began to understand new layers of myself that I don't think I would have been able to access the way I could without having gone through what I went through with Eliza. But these layers of like, oh, wait a second. Okay, this is what trauma is. This is what attachment injury is. This is actually shows me what my childhood experience was and all the missed experiences that happened there, which then actually explained, the anxiety that I had lived with my whole life, not knowing I was living with anxiety my whole life. So when you have complex PTSD from early developmental injury and trauma, it just feels like you. So you're living your life in your kind of activated state, and it just is like personality. But there was always this feeling of something being wrong with me and needing to fix myself, and seeking a lot of trying to get my family to understand and get on the same page with me. And don't you want to heal? And don't you want to like understand what happened to us? And um, nobody was in this on the same page as me, so that made me feel even more isolated and othered, and like something's wrong with me, like why can't I just get on with my life? But then through all those trainings, and then I've read like hundreds of books now, it really just gave me the language. It helped me see the bigger picture of my past, which was, I mean, it's unearthed some very distressing realities about my childhood and my
Hmm.
father, and things
Yeah.
that happened to me um, that have been very hard to come to terms with. Uh, and yet, and my mom and my sister and brother, honestly, my whole family, I can see it so much more clearly now what happened to me and why I've been the way I've been my whole life.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So those people listening, they might wonder, well, what happened? And I want to be mindful of what you said about it being pretty fresh and also it involving your family. But
Yeah.
is there something that you can share so people could relate to, or that you would be willing to
Yeah.
elaborate a little bit on?
Yes. And I appreciate that. So, you know, I actually want to just put out there that early childhood experiences have such far-reaching effects on who we are and how we view the world. And every human has had to mold themselves to adapt to get their fundamental needs met. So we all carry that. We all have had to cut off parts of ourselves. We all have had to learn how to behave certain ways, talk in certain ways to get our needs met by our primary caregivers. And I think I want to just like bring to light that every individual's needs matters. So if the need was to be seen, heard, held, loved in a certain way, and that need wasn't met, that is traumatic. So people tend to think, and there are varying degrees of things that can happen to people, but that, and I think people tend to use this like extreme to kind of dismiss or invalidate their own experiences that they had as little people, where they weren't attuned to, their needs weren't met, they were emotionally neglected, which is extremely harmful to the development of a person. And so I want to bring to light that when too much, too soon, too little, whatever, too much happens, and there's not a protective person there or a person there to guide you through it, a compassionate, supportive other, that can have such far-reaching effects on a person's sense of self, and how they view the world. And for me, there are so many layers of things that happen that I thought were just things that happen. And then I began to realize this actually comes from a lot of dysfunction and intergenerational dysfunction and collective dysfunction rooted in patriarchy, misogyny, sexism, capitalism, you name it, all the isms, and how that shaped me. Yeah.
And when I know what you're talking about in terms of, I can relate to that from my upbringing. And some people might sort of have an idea of what it might mean. But to me personally, for example, I can see a lot of the things that have happened to me or with me that I would put in that area is what's coming out now with my daughter. I can see and hear certain things that have happened to me that is now being transformed. So for example, just the other day, my daughter comes home and she says something and I give her an answer. And because she is so emotionally, developed or has been developed for me, mature, yes. She said, Mom, what I actually would need is for you to say, I'm really sorry for you. That's really painful. And I thought, spot on. So I changed my language and I said, I'm really sorry. And then she said, do you mean it? And I said, yeah, I actually do. But it was such an immediate learning for both of us, for her to be able to express her needs, for me to be able to shift so quickly out of whatever train I was in to say, oh yeah, okay, I need to empathize here. Your need is empathy at the moment and not rules or not well-meant suggestions, but actually just empathy. But then she was checking, like, do you mean it? And I said, yeah, I actually do. And I think when I look back at my history, it's like certain things my parents were just not, it was not available to them. And to me, it is much more available that I can switch when I'm on a train going nowhere. My daughter picks me up and says, oh, stop here. We need to go this way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I was, when you said, she has to kind of check to see if you mean it. that's such an important thing to talk about too, of incongruency. Like a child feels. So there's the felt sense, there's the feeling of being attuned with and understood, which is, nonverbal. So you can have a parent saying they understand you, but does the child feel understood? And we live in a society that, puts parent before child. So oftentimes the child's feelings, even if they're saying, I don't feel that way, and the parent is saying, but I'm saying I feel this way, but I'm not really feeling that from you. Whose truth matters,
Exactly. Who's the authority
who's
on
the
the matter
authority.
of the feeling?
Yeah.
And this is just about bringing some examples. For example, the
Yeah.
other day my daughter said, Mommy, this person, she mentioned a person, I don't trust this person. And I said, so why do you not trust this person? And she said, because of this person's hair. I'm like, okay. And in that moment, I could hear in my head what my parent would have said. They would have said, oh, it's okay, they're okay, whatever. And they would have devalued my own feelings. So I said to her,
Yes.
it's really good that you noticed that. Trust your inner knowing about that.
Yep.
I didn't speak about the other person, whether they are what she believes or not. It didn't matter, but I said, trust your own inner feeling. And I think we grew up in a society or in a time when many parents, even today, don't have that available, that they are self-reflective.
Yes. Yes. Well, and I love how you said it doesn't matter. Like, because now we're getting into the parent-child dyad, that relationship where the parent is always, in my opinion, responsible for the well-being of the child. It is never the child's responsibility to try to figure out the needs of the parent. And so as a parent of two living children, and then my Eliza, sometimes it doesn't matter, like you just said, what I think is right or wrong. What matters is what they feel and what they believe. And we want to support that development of their own sense of trusting their intuition, their sense of self, how they feel through the world. And as a parent, sometimes, again, like what we think is right or wrong, it doesn't really matter. I mean, and that's obviously there are times when it does matter, but when we're talking about feelings, and so I also want to mention, as we keep talking about this, for me, part of my journey, that empathy you're talking about, I have come to learn, this is probably my greatest takeaway on this whole odyssey I've been on, is every human just wants to be empathized with and be seen and heard and held and loved and understood. It's a fundamental needs. And we all needed that as little people. And we all need it now as big people on this journey. And so my biggest takeaways are not only figuring out how to provide that kind of attuned support to my living children, but I'm reparenting all those wounded parts within myself. And so that really being aware enough to catch some of that conditioning that comes in, the limiting beliefs, those voices that belong to society or to our parents or to whomever. And, not get caught up in that. Just meet the person exactly where they are and honor whatever that experience is that they're having in that moment, which I have to do all the time for myself as well. And then I have to do it with my children. I don't need to get into a battle with them. It's like, okay, what need is not being met here? What am I not seeing? How can I support you? And I feel that way too. That's been the biggest healing factor for me, is learning how to do that work with all my my exiled parts of self as well.
So you expressed, or you explained how you went about after the loss of Eliza. So your traumas that you unearthed, you said that they're still fresh or in the process of dealing with them. Let's call it dealing, without going into details. But are you doing this right now on a practical sense? So if people have heard us and said, oh my God, yeah, this could be part of my journey as well, what are you doing that is really helpful?
Yes. Okay. And there's some layers there, because I want to point to implicit memory, just, right? Like, that is feeling. It is not memories that live explicitly, which maybe you can help me put that in different terms real quickly. But when things happen pre-verbally or in utero, they become implicit memories, and traumatic memories are implicit. They live in the body. They're not in the conscious. They're not in conscious awareness. And so for me, I've learned to be kind of a detective of really learning to, through the help of interrelationship focusing, which has been huge for me, and parts work. So I'll just throw those out there as things to go explore for yourself, to really begin to, take a sensation that exists in my body, because even like right now I'm experiencing something, but to be able to explore it more deeply, to come into relationship with it, to understand it, and to trust the message that this is providing. So a lot of deep listening and being with things that are very uncomfortable within my body, and then working alongside a therapist who can help me interpret and kind of guide me through that, to make sense out of some of the things that I can't make sense of, because they're so they're so implicit, or I'm getting a little off, but so I would say,
so explicit memory would be something that you clearly remember. For example, okay, I stood there, my father stood there, and this is what he said, and this is how I reacted. That's explicit. And implicit might be more something you have a sense or something, a physical experience of it, but you can't actually make logical sense with it. Would that be correct in your understanding?
And I think it's the things that don't make logical sense to me have been my markers in the sand that have led me to explore more deeply, to be, why is that? So the why am I the way I am? Why do I feel that way? Why am I reacting this way? And it feels misaligned, or it causes some kind of anxiety or something activation in me. That is my guidepost now to a place that I know is unresolved and needs attention.
Yeah.
So that, though, that's a very different kind of working with yourself, is to be able to identify the implicit, because it feels so much like you. So how do you really learn to understand that it could actually be unresolved issues at play in your life, affecting the way you are viewing things, affecting the way you're feeling, affecting the way you're thinking, the way you're in relationships with others? It's not super easy to navigate, because you have to connect with your body. And that's, I think, the disembodied culture in which we live in is then what makes this kind of work, especially with complex traumatization, so difficult, because you are having to learn to come into a very deep, intimate relationship with all the feelings in your body, because they're actually holding the whole story of what happened. And to access the whole story of what happened, Yeah.
And I can hear by the cadence of your speech, this is really interesting. And it seems like as if we're opening a whole new chapter or topic, which I would love to dive into with you, but I think we have to give it enough space and credit to in terms of time, because I think actually I'm so interested what's in this whole new chapter that you, and I could hear with the kind of speed that you came into. So, but with the time that we have for the podcast, I would actually hope that we could speak again. How does that sound to you?
Yes, that sounds amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, this was sort of like your story, your background, and you alluded a little bit, and people can really find out more about you, Betsy, on the links in the show notes, as always. So, and also Betsy gave us some ideas of what she's done, some of the words, some of the ways, and you can find all of that on her website as well. And so for today, if there was one thing that you would want to give the listener as a glimmer of hope, of integration, of healing, what would that be?
I think you actually said it so well when it is like, just because something is painful, it is not traumatic. And that we can actually, if we learn how to be with our pain and discomfort, it is actually such an incredible portal for self-understanding and really profound healing. So to not let darkness scare you away from doing whatever the work is that you might be feeling the need to do, but to really lean into it, knowing that as cliche as this is, but it is in the darkness where we see the light. Mm-hmm. And we can't find it if we're not willing to go into the darkness, and that the darkness doesn't always mean a forever sentence of trauma or pain and suffering. It doesn't have to mean that. Yeah.
Actually, just before you mentioned the light, I saw this figure, or this I think it's a statue of, it has been used with the quote, where the light comes through. I don't remember the whole quote now, but I actually, just before you said something.
Yes, Rumi. I think it's a Rumi quote.
It absolutely is, yeah. We'll figure it out. I'll write it in the show notes. But it's that picture that I had just before when you said it. So thank you so much, Betsy. This has been interesting. And I'm actually interested in what we're going to speak about next. So the two of us, we're going to find another time and look for part 2 of this conversation. But for now, thank you so much for your time and for your openness in sharing about your story and about Eliza.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was an honor to be here, and I look forward to more conversations.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.